Your book talks about some of the outstanding women of the time. I'm not going to ask them on the test, except no, Margaret Sanger is not here right now. I mean, your book, it does mention Florence Nightingale and Clara Barton. Oh yeah, I do want to know Clara Nightingale and Barton. These women made it popular for young girls to go into the nursing profession. Up until this time, the word nurse meant person who carries out the garbage. Really, it was looked on as being a very low profession. But Florence Nightingale and Clara Barton, Nightingale was in Britain and Clara Barton in the United States, made it the profession very popular. Florence Nightingale was in the Crimean War, and she helped the wounded and sick during the Crimean War. Clara Barton helped the wounded and sick during the American Civil War. And a lot of the men were hard against her at first, but then as time went on, they began to realize more and more that her services were needed, and it's believed that many a person was able to live a good many years as a result of the efforts of these women who would have died had it not been for the efforts that they put forth. All right. Education. I've turned to page 594. For the first time, state government-run schools were set up. Now, that's not to say there hadn't been schools before, but before this time, most schools had been run by the church. But it was decided that, well, some people are not members of a church, and more the people of the world turned the educating of their children over to the state. And education became a matter of putting kids into a classroom with a teacher. At first, most of the teachers were men, but eventually, most school teachers became women, and you had your typical stereotype of the female school teacher teaching young elementary school children, teaching them their ABCs. And classrooms became about the size of 30 or so pupils, sometimes a little bit less and sometimes a bit more. But 30 or more pupils put in a classroom. The blackboard came into use. And the book calls it mass education because they were trying to teach everybody from the same textbooks. Again, they were using some of the same textbooks that had been used in the church schools before, particularly some of the primers that taught the children to read. These have changed somewhat down through the years. One reason for the interest in education was factory workers, probably factory owners, realized that they needed to have people who could read to work in their factory. And they couldn't imagine, but I mean, I spent 27 years at Lockheed. And Lockheed required that you take a test before they hired you. And even the janitors had to take a test, even the laundry room workers had to take a test. You had to be able to read basic, simple instructions and do some basic, simple math, you know, just to at least do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. And if you couldn't do those, then they would not hire you based on you failing a company test. But then if you started putting an airplane together, you had to do it according to a blueprint, and the blueprints were written. I mean, it wasn't anybody with an average IQ could understand them, but you had to be able to follow instructions, follow the blueprint. And again, factory owners, even as long ago as the 1870s, realized we need educated people to work in our factory just to help us put the stuff together we're putting together. Persons who can read instructions, persons who can write. Factory people learned it. You don't give an order verbally and then send it across the factory and expect everybody's going to understand it. You want something done, you have to write down your orders. And you'll find in any factory, at least the ones I've been in, they have what's called an ANVO. Anybody know what that stands for, ANVO?
Invoice.
What's that? It means accept no verbal orders. In other words, all orders must be written down. That way there's going to be less confusion of what they mean. Write them down, because the way you say it and the way the other person hears it oftentimes leaves room for a lot of... So basically they needed people who could read and write to work in factories. And also they began to put out newspapers, and they felt like that they could better control the thinking of the people in a mass society if everybody was thinking alike. So the newspapers were set up in part to influence the way of your thinking. Again, compulsory education created a demand for teachers. Most of these teachers were women. I think I've already mentioned that. Some of your more rural European countries had high illiteracy rates, particularly in places like Romania and Austria. They had a lot of illiteracy, but Germany, Great Britain, and France and Scandinavian countries virtually eliminated illiteracy by the year 1900. Leisure. Team sports began to take hold. Baseball was, some people believe that the origin of baseball goes back to the 1300s, the game of town ball, where they would take a sock and wrap the sock in old rags, wrap old rags in the sock, and hit the ball with a stick. This game was known to be played in the 1300s. But finally, someone organized it, and the first baseball game in America was played at Cooperstown, New York, which is the home of where the Hall of Fame is, in Cooperstown. In 1869, the first professional baseball team was organized. This is something that's not in the book, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. But the professional means that the teams paid their players. The first team was the Cincinnati Red Stockings. But no, the Cincinnati Red Stockings are not the Cincinnati Reds of today. The Cincinnati Red Stockings moved to Boston and became the Boston Red Sox. And a new team took over Cincinnati and called themselves the Cincinnati Redlegs. Today they're called the Cincinnati Reds. Just a little bit of trivia, that won't be on the test, but the purpose is to show you that team sports, not only a team of baseball games, but football. In the 1890s, a man wanted to figure out how could he keep the boys occupied during the cold winter months, so he nailed a basket on the wall, and they called that game basketball. At first it was played with 9 players like baseball, but then they started having 18 boys on one, 9 on each side, 18 boys on the floor at one time was just too much, so they narrowed it down to 5. This was the beginning of basketball. Anyway, with the team sports, they began to hire umpires to enforce the rules and call the balls and strikes, you might say, call the fouls, and have umpires to enforce the rules. And cities would hire their own teams and begin to compete with each other. This became especially true with the invention of the railroad. They could transport the teams from one city to another fairly rapidly. All right. The Enlightenment gave way to the Romantic period. Let me ask you, do you talk about these periods, the Enlightenment and Romantic period, in your literature classes by any chance, or is this one of you is raising your hand, at least one other of you nodding your head? Okay, then music appreciation. What's that? Music appreciation. If you run into those terms also, yeah. Well, anyway, these periods are characterized by the, you might say, the main thought patterns were going at the time. Now, the Romantic era, among other things, was characterized by realism in the art world. Your book shows a picture of a romantic drawing, or romantic artwork on page 597. Some people have said that the Romantic era was a reaction against the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, with its skepticism, its deism, its people were not sure if they believed, even if they believed there was a God. The Romantic was a reaction. In other words, where the people were going off in this direction, Then they turn around and start heading back in the other direction. And I'm old enough that I've seen cases where the parents are indifferent to religion. Their children become religious fanatics, almost. Or vice versa, the parents are religious fanatics, the children are indifferent. These things tend to go back and forth in cycles. The Romantic era was an era that you might say was more religious than the Enlightenment era before it had been. But it also was characterized by men such as Edgar Allan Poe, and let me see if his name is even here. That's it? It is where
the picture is, where it says Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh, they give a whole section to him. Okay, Edgar Allan Poe, I'm glad you, yeah, I got there in front of my face in big bold print, I didn't even see it. But Edgar Allan Poe, yeah. I mentioned him, he was an American. Now, for those of you who have studied Poe, he only lived about 41 years. He, like so many popular, whether they be singers or artists or whatever, he had a problem with drugs and alcohol. And it shows up in his writing. He envisioned, for instance, pink elephants. And again, he was one of the first people to talk about pink elephants on the wall. And this may have been as a result of some of the visions he had while he was in his drunken stupors. And now, when I taught this in high school just for a few weeks, I mean, I student taught in high school, some of those students say their teachers told them that Edgar Allan Poe did not have a drug problem. Have any of you heard otherwise? Or
I heard he had an opium addiction.
That he had an opium addiction?
Yes.
Yeah, well, drugs, yeah, I've had a drug problem, yeah.
But not anything else.
Opium was a really common addiction at that time. A painkiller, yes, but it would grab a person and not let go. Because I mean, I was just asking, anyone heard he didn't have a problem? I mean, like I say, some of my students were told me that their teacher told them he didn't have, but I've never seen that in print. All the literature I've read on him. He wrote a lot of what you might call ghost stories. That was really popular during his time. Ghost stories, mystery stories. One of his favorite poems, Fall of the House of Usher, yeah, which is listed right here on the, I mean, it's narrated here on the page. And again, the whole story has a very ethereal, ghostly effect.